Africa, most likely the biggest victim of the modern age. The second largest continent once held some of the most powerful empires throughout history. But from the 1600s to now, Africa was brutally conquered, destroyed, uprooted, and left to pick up the pieces. But what if this never happened? What if Africa was never colonized? Now, how can we make this a reality? To me, there are 4 key points that if they had all gone differently, we could have seen a free Africa persist into the modern era. The first is in 1622, the Battle of Mumbai. I'm pretty sure I pronounced that wrong. Anyway, in the Portuguese-Congo War. This was one of the first military incursions of the Europeans into sub-Saharan Africa, and took place as the Portuguese wished to expand their colony of Angola, which was gifted to them by the Kingdom of Congo in 1575. The Battle of Mumbai was the only major battle and secured a Portuguese victory in the war. In this timeline, the Portuguese are decisively crushed and are forced to leave the colony, stunting Portuguese expansion into Africa. Now we look to Britain, to the First Anglo-Ashanti War. The Ashanti Empire bordered the Gold Coast colonies of Britain and the Netherlands. After building tensions, conflict broke out after a British officer was assassinated by the Ashanti in 1824. The first British force sent to deal with the Ashanti was slaughtered, but the second was able to score a victory and move the border north to the Pra River, leaving the Ashanti to their fate of subjugation by the British in the following years. In this timeline, the second incursion ends up just like the first, not only kicking the British out of the Gold Coast, but depleting the white population in their colonies of the Cape and Sierra Leone. Let's also say the Dutch are eventually forced out of the area as well. Speaking of the Cape, the third event that changes is the outcome of the Anglo-Zulu War. In our timeline, the Zulu were notoriously resistant to British attempts to subjugate them, able to score many victories before their defeat in the Anglo-Zulu War. Once again, this timeline depends on a European defeat. This time, it's the British being unable to secure Zulu land and suffering crushing blow after crushing blow, eventually leading to the British giving up as the constant attempts would continuously deplete resources of their Cape colony. Finally, after all of these events, the final change that must be made is the decision of King Leopold II of Belgium to annex the territory of the Congo, not even for Belgium, but for himself. This crazy out-of-the-blue act freaked out Europeans due to the sheer magnitude of land that was claimed. Because of this, a conference was held in London so the Europeans could divide up Africa. In this timeline, King Leopold II is too intimidated to claim the land due to the reputation Africa would have gained up to this point as unmanageable. Disaster after disaster would lead the Europeans to decide that Africa was more trouble than what it was worth, and would turn their attention to consolidating their power elsewhere. Africa would be left to forge its own destiny. Sadly, North Africa would most likely be left to the same fate as in our world. Being so close to the mainland, it was easy for the French to colonize Algeria. However, with this being their only colony in Africa, along with being so close, I would imagine much more assimilation of the Algerian land into France proper. Egypt would be taken from the Ottomans by the British to secure the Suez Canal. However, British control would likely end near the modern-day Sudan border, with the Madhis gaining control over Sudan. With Europe less willing to put effort into Africa, Morocco would most likely be able to keep its independence and remain a power in North Africa. Now, let's talk African powers. The previously named Ashanti would have control over the Gold Coast, rich with, well, gold. You can see the limits of European creativity when it came to naming. This control of gold would make them a rich and powerful nation, much like the Mali Empire before them. The Abanisians, or Ethiopians, were on their way towards modernization in our timeline and were actually quite capable, throwing back many attempts to colonize them, most famously against the Italians. Ethiopia had always been a regional power, and quite a strong one. It would continue to be so, and would most likely move into Yemen, gaining control over the entrance into the Gulf of Aden. The Sokoto Caliphate would continue to be a major power and would exert its influence over the surrounding area. Central Africa would be dominated by the Congolese. The above powers would likely modernize in the late 19th and former half of the 20th century, then expand further and gain strength. Looking at Europe, no matter the victor of World War I, European colonialism would likely fizzle out without the resources of Africa, and without the conquest of an entire continent behind them, backing their perceived God-ordained right to rule. Indochina and North Africa would likely gain their independence in the 1920s, with Britain and the Dutch desperately holding on to India and Indonesia. The colonization climate of the Cold War, however, would be pushed back to the 1920s and they would eventually relent. South Africa would be released as well. Britain would be left as an insignificant island with no empire to back it up. The balance of powers of the old world would be pushed south towards Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa would turn into the new hotbed for world powers. With Africa's vast populations, we could see Sokoto, Ethiopia, and Congo becoming major powers in world affairs. Wars between Sokoto and Congo would decide the major power in Central Africa, and whether or not it would fall to Islam or the native religions of the region. This is a split that would divide all of Africa north to south, with Islam and traces of Christianity dominating the north and the south maintaining their native religions. I believe it very possible a large conflict could break out around the same time as World War II, as Islamic forces in the north attempt to secure all of Africa for Islam. Ethiopia, being a bastion of Christianity, would likely fight against the northern Muslim forces to maintain said Christianity. Looking at factors like population density, I believe the north would be unsuccessful in their attempt of spreading Islam to all of Africa, and the southern native religions would be maintained. A war of this scale would lead to an increase in nationalism, creating the conditions for the consolidation of tribes into nation-states. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the African nations would join the rest of the world as a part of the global community and economy. Religious conflicts would be rampant in Central Africa, but besides that, the continent would be a relatively stable place, home to many more first world countries than in our own timeline. When it comes to Africa, our timeline is most likely the darkest. The Europeans not only conquered an entire continent, but destroyed it. But still, it's interesting to theorize about the world that could have been.